What's up, you guys? This is Devin with Century Effects Studios, back with another video, and today we're going to be talking about the 3 clicks method as it applies to portraiture and getting a shadow depth of field background or a blurry background. Now, for those of you who do not know what the 3 clicks method is, go back and watch my video. I'm going to link it up here somewhere, but once you see that video, you'll understand what the 3 click method is to getting the best exposure. So this 3 click or 3 clicks method, it allows you to track and gain an accurate exposure based on what your camera's telling you. So now that you know that, you can apply this to settings that will get you a blurry background. Now, a couple of pro tips that you need to understand. First, you're going to need fast glass, something with at least a 2.8 aperture or higher, you know, a 1.4 aperture or maximum 1.8 aperture, so you can really get the blurry background effect. You probably also want a telephoto lens, something with a, I want to say 50 millimeter end on it, or a 70, 85, 100 millimeter, 200 millimeter end, perfect lenses, but they have to be fast glass. So typically these are expensive pieces of glass. And you also, another pro tip would be to find your sharpest aperture. Usually the older lenses, they're not sharp at their widest aperture. So say for example, you have an old 50 millimeter 1.8 version 2. Well, that piece of plastic is not sharp at 1.8. It's usually sharp around 2.8. So you're gonna have to stop it down maybe 1 or stop in a third to get your sharpest actual image out of this. So if you're doing this, you're like, oh, my background's blurry, but my subject is not as sharp as it can be, and I know I'm nailing focus, it's probably because your lens is not sharp to begin with. So try to find your sharpest aperture, which is usually stopped down on older lenses. Now, some of the newer lenses are great. Samyang has some great glass. Sigma has some great art lenses that are also great at their widest aperture. So think about getting some of that. They're not the most expensive lenses in the world, but they'll give you a nice sharp result. So let's get into some, I would say, portrait-like settings to understand our 3 click method. Now, for those of you, again, the 3 click method is just 3 clicks, like I said before. So say, for example, you're at 1/125th of a second, f8, and ISO 800. Now, if you're at this setting, you're not going to get much of a blurry background at all. Your background is probably going to be distracting you. You're going to probably be able to see some things in the background that you don't want to see. You would take your existing exposure value of 1/125th of a second at f8, ISO 800, and you would dissect it. What's the first thing that I need to adjust to get me a blurry background? The main thing you're going to adjust is your aperture. And that's mainly the number one thing that you want to adjust, and almost the only thing that you want to adjust to get you that blurry shallow depth of field. So to get this, you're going to have to offer more light to that exposure, whether it be adding a flash or adjusting your exposure itself. Now, we're not going to talk about adding a flash right now because that's on another level. But we are going to talk about adjusting our exposure the best way we know how. Now, this exposure itself is actually working against itself, and it's working against itself in the ISO category, because ISO at 800 while your f-stop is at f8 is really drowning out a lot of light from your exposure. So to up this, you're going to bring your f-stop up 1 stop. Now, going from 1 stop from f8 will be going to 5/6. So again, we're going to use our 3 clicks method. If we're using our 3 clicks method, going from f8, you will go from f8 to f7.1 to 6.3 to 5/6. Now you might be saying to yourself, oh my goodness, I'm changing my exposure, I'm on manual mode, I'm going to wreck the camera. No, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. Why? Because you're going to now adjust that ISO that was getting in your way to ISO 400. This ISO 400 will give you less light and equivocate your exposure, because when you opened up your aperture from f8 to f5.6, you brought more light into the lens, but you have to equivocate that by bringing down your ISO, which you want it to bring down in the first place, because it's hindering your exposure. You want to get a blurrier background. So now we're going to do that even more. Now we're going to get an even blurrier background. So let's add a stop of light to your aperture by going from f5.6 to f4. You go from f5.6 to f4. Let's do it slowly. Going from f5.6, you brighten that aperture, you go to f5. You go from f5 to f4.5. and then you'll land on that one stop increment of f4. Now you might be saying, oh my goodness, I've changed the exposure again, I'm a little overexposed. Well, take that exposure, go from ISO 400, excuse me, and then you will go to ISO 200. This will even that exposure out. Granted that your original exposure was even to begin with. Now, we're sitting at 1/125th of a second, f4, ISO 200. You know what I'm saying? Dang, Devin, I need to get an even blurrier background. Okay, well, I'm rolling with you. I love me some blurry backgrounds for my portraits. So let's go from f4 to f2.8. Now we're getting in the fast class. Oh yeah. Okay, so now we're going to f4 to 2.8. So let's click back, going from f4 to 3.5 to 3.2 to 2.8. That's another stop of light added to your exposure. You might be saying, oh no, Devin, it's too bright. It's too bright. Well, let's go back to ISO. Let's go from ISO, we're at 200 now. Let's go to ISO 100. Let's go to ISO 100. Now you should have an even exposure based on your original exposure settings. Granted, they were at an even exposure to begin with. Now you might be saying to yourself, oh my goodness, well, I want an even blurrier background now that I can get my exposure equivocated with this 3 clicks method for portraiture. I need to get it really, really blurry. Well, if you have a Canon camera, in most situations you're out of luck right now because your ISO is capped at 100. Now you might be able to get to ISO 50 if you have a higher end camera. So let's do that. If you're going from ISO 100 to ISO 50, this might be an extended ISO for some of you guys, but if you go from ISO 100 to ISO 50, you go from ISO 100 to ISO, I believe, 85 to ISO 64 to ISO 50. You might be saying to yourself, Devin, it's dark now, it's dark now. I adjusted all 3 clicks again, but it's dark now. What should I do? Well, you gotta have a faster lens. If you have a fast enough lens, you're able to open it up another stop from f2.8 to f2. So let's go. f2.8, click it again, 2.5, click it again, 2.2, click it again, 2.0. Now this comes with a little asterisk. Other lenses that are manual lenses, that are cinema lenses, they're gonna have f-stops written a little bit different when it comes to the wider end of the spectrum, because they might be measured a slight bit different, especially the older lenses. But generally, most lenses are still measured in thirds when you open up past 2.8. This is what we got, guys. This will get you that shallow depth of field. All you did was use a 3-click method. You used the 3-click method to bring your ISO down. You equivocated at 3 clicks to your aperture, and you didn't even touch the shutter speed. The shutter speed is actually perfect in most situations. Why? Because most people at a slow speed move around the 1/25th of a second range. So that'll be good for that. Most lenses that are between 50 millimeters and 100 millimeters will work well as far as handshake is concerned at 1/125th of a second. So you won't experience any handshake from the image in most situations. And then you also will have a shallow depth of field, and you're opening up your camera to the amount of light you need to equivocate the exposure. You did it with the 3 clicks method. You got the blurry background that you wanted, and it was just some simple click, click, click. I'm done with Century FX Studios. I hope this method helped you get the shallow depth of field that you wanted, the blurry background that you wanted for your portraiture to look great. There are some limitations, of course, your lens. It could also be that your camera may not extend to a certain ISO that you want, but for the most case, you're gonna start to see the differences in your images. And then if you get a cheap 50 millimeter prime lens from Canon, you can pretty much get almost all of these apertures. Think about that. I'm done with Century FX Studios, and stay tuned for the next video. Thanks for watching.